Today's show is sponsored by Factor. Still verifying help desk callers with questions hackers can Google? Every security question is a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. If you're using Okta, Factor Identity Portal transforms your organization's verification process. Authenticate users with real-time MFA factors in seconds, not minutes. Slash call time 60%. Eliminate social engineering attacks and streamline help desk workflows. Check out Factor's Taco AI, the first AI agent for Okta, on their website. Your team gets one powerful dashboard for all user verification needs. Try Factor, factor.io. That's FCTR.io. Free for 60 days.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Another weekend perspective as we jump into the second half of 2025. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's having a good summer or good winter if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. Apologize for this one going out a little bit late. We got tied up with some things with life. Life sometimes gets in the way of things, and sometimes you just can't get around to recording until later in the day. But hope everybody's doing well. We're going to do sort of a quick mid-year update, mid-year kind of report card for the cloud. Going to try and stay away from pure AI topics, kind of get back to cloud topics, back to our roots a little bit, and kind of do a report card on where we see the cloud right now, what's happening with the cloud, what's happening with the big hyperscale cloud providers, what types of things are going well, where there's some changes happening in the marketplace, or at least appears to be changes in the marketplace. We're going to dig into all that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Vasion Print. The problem with print is it's a resource suck. IT teams are spending too much time on troubleshooting and upkeep. The biggest offender? Print servers. So get rid of them. Swap your outdated, resource-intensive infrastructure for Vasion Print, formerly known as Printer Logic, and get serverless, direct IP, secure printing for any device, anywhere. Centralized print management reduces overhead and workload and increases productivity, which is great for your IT team and your bottom line. Increase security, remove scripts and GPOs, and enable self-service user deployments. Secure, seamless, and scalable. That's what you get when you eliminate print servers. See how at vasion.com. And we're back, and hope everybody's doing well. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dig into a little bit of a kind of a mid-year, mid-2025 check-in on what's going on with the cloud. Obviously, we try and cover it every week and every month, but I thought we'd kind of do a check-in, mid-year report card, if you will, on just some big trends that are happening around cloud computing and whether or not any of them will have any sort of material impact on the strategy that the clouds are taking going forward, some things that they're doing to try and position themselves for what's going on in the future. Are there any things happening within the company that have caught our eye? Any major trends going on just around the world, around the industry, around the economy that may potentially have some impact on all this stuff? And thought I would dig into some of those things here at the mid-year point. It's always good to sort of, as the year goes along, sometimes stop and pause and see what's going on and whether or not we think these things are big enough topics, if you will, to impact what the second half of the year might look like, or investment that they're making, into what's going on with their bigger trends and so forth. So let's kind of dive into that. I had 4 or 5 big things that I thought were worth diving into, and we'll go into all of them. And would love to get some feedback from folks if they think these are big enough to keep an eye on for us to continue to dig into, or if they just seem like sort of minor blips. So first one I had on my list was data sovereignty concerns. So, obviously there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of discussion around things like tariffs and protection. And, since we've got a new administration in the United States who have been very aggressive around the potential of tariffs, whether or not they actually fully implement them or change them is going to depend on, what day of the week it is or what month of the year it is or whatever. But, there's a lot of concerns, especially in Europe. We're beginning to see, more and more discussions there. Some of the countries in particular, beginning to have big concerns about not only where their data is stored, but, if it is being stored outside of their control. So in a cloud provider, in a SaaS provider, if that provider is a U.S. company versus a localized company or a non-U.S. company, a lot of discussions happening, and we're beginning to see some regulations happening. We've seen some interesting things come out of some of the concerns about tariffs or the what looked like an implementation of a tariff, and then it got pulled back. We've seen this a couple of times with some of the services that impact government agencies and others and so forth. So I think there's a lot that potentially can go on there. I don't know, a lot of the cloud providers, whether it's AWS or Azure or Google or some of the regional ones, do have presence in different countries. That's evolved quite a bit over the last decade or so. But it'll be very interesting to see, how they adapt to the, how strict it will get into, do they have to be a U.S. company, right? Or for example, if Microsoft or AWS or somebody creates a European subsidiary, does that take care of things as long as they can validate the data is stored in the host country in Europe, for example, or wherever it might be. So I think that's going to be worth keeping an eye on. I think there is, we're already beginning to see from a lot of the EU countries in particular. We'll see how much this spreads into Asia and pockets of Asia. Asia's kind of a big space, lots of different countries, lots of different government entities. It's not obviously one big thing, just like Europe's not one big thing. But it'll be interesting to sort of watch that. I think we're already beginning to see not only concerns about that, but we're beginning to see some shifting investment around, kind of, I don't want to call them worst case scenarios, but just, considered scenarios and where investment's beginning to go in that. And we're seeing it, in the defense space in Europe in particular, but we're also seeing it and hearing about it in the IT space and the cloud space as well. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how that evolves, how some of the regional providers, begin to step in to fill a void or to address concerns, or again, if regulations start to come along and a U.S. owned subsidiary in Asia or Europe doesn't cut the regulation, it'll be interesting to sort of see how that works out. And I think it'll be something that won't necessarily be completely clean. I think we'll end up seeing a lot of, kind of secondary, whether they're resale partnerships or they are just, different ways of people building partnerships to sort of get around some of those things. Because again, if you told a company, for example, well, you don't have access to the Microsoft Office suite anymore, you need to find an alternative for your document solution or your collaboration solution for a Teams or a Zoom or anything like that. Those aren't the easiest things in the world to find, whether it's like an open source solution or something that can be managed locally. Not the easiest thing in the world to find. And then especially if you've got to ask people to make changes or learn new skills or learn new tools or find compatibilities. Again, that's just a huge amount of friction that you'd like to avoid if possible. But again, sometimes laws and global political things, have a bigger impact on than just, hey, we prefer not to change anything technology-wise. So that sort of was the first one on my list. It's not necessarily the biggest one, but it's obviously a big concern that, as we're watching the political, world kind of spin around, we've reached a point where political decisions and technology decisions feel like they're much more intertwined than they were, a few years ago even. So we'll sort of see where that goes. Next thing I have on my list, and I guess this was sort of secondarily on this, kind of related to sovereignty, is will we begin to see the growth of regional clouds, or do we see, again, like I mentioned, subsidiaries of U.S. companies? Do we begin to see the sort of data center providers begin to do some interesting things? So whether it's one of the local ones that owns data centers and has been subleasing space to the cloud providers as they get into region, will they start to step up and be a bigger force, a bigger presence in that thing? I think that's going to be sort of interesting to watch as well. And that's just not just in Europe, but also in Asia, in Africa, in South America, places outside the US. So again, sort of secondary to that digital sovereignty thing is we start to see some regional clouds do some interesting things. They could be very vertically integrated. They could be application specific, but I think there's an opportunity there as well. Third thing, and I guess we'll kind of jump into the thing we always talk about, sort of follow the money. I think there's an interesting kind of thing to watch here, and we mentioned it a couple of times in the last few shows. I know Brandon and I covered it in the Cloud and AI News of the Week. I touched on it a little bit in one of the shows previous to maybe the last Weekend Perspective show. And that's, we saw some data coming out of this East Meets West keynote presentation. It was on slide 27. Again, there's a link in the show notes if you haven't caught up with this one. But there was an interesting slide in there, slide 27, and it basically looked at, where the NVIDIA GPUs were going. And basically what they were trying to figure out was, do we expect to just sort of see the companies that have been, big and powerful and investing, capital investing in the cloud? Will they just continue to do that for GPUs, into the AI cycle, or are there some things that are happening that are different there? And it's an interesting slide to take a look at. I think the biggest takeaway from that is they basically break down kind of where cloud market share is today, with AWS having like 44% and Azure having 20 or 25%, and Google having a lesser percent than that. And then they sort of have some other ones above, in that as well. So Oracle is mentioned, CoreWeave is mentioned, and so forth. But the most interesting piece was they sort of mapped where people are today with their cloud revenue to their NVIDIA spend, right? So if you have 44% share, for example, as AWS, should you have 44% share of NVIDIA spend? Or if you are Azure, should you have 25% and 25%? And I think the biggest takeaway from that was AWS was the company that had the biggest difference between what they had grown in terms of cloud market share and the gap between that and what they had bought in terms of GPUs. And it was like, and I forget the exact numbers, but they're in the chart. It's like 44% market share today in cloud, but they only owned about 20% of the NVIDIA GPUs. And they were the one company amongst the three big companies that didn't just essentially match where they were cloud market share with where they were NVIDIA. And again, it's an interesting thing to sort of dig into because obviously AWS has been talking for a while about their training chips, their inferentia chips, their own homegrown training and inference chips for AI. But so you go, oh, okay, well they've invested in themselves as much as they've been invested in sort of the industry standard with NVIDIA. But the thing, and that's a fair sort of argument that might get made of like, okay, well that's why the difference exists. But where it sort of comes back to being like, well, I don't know about that, is when you look at Google's, who obviously Google has made huge investments in their TPU chips, they are very much in line with where they were. Now, again, this is where you sort of get into, well, Google, AWS has nearly $120 billion run rate. Google Cloud has a $49 billion run rate. And so, as we're talking about percentages, maybe they all just sort of even themselves out because AWS has such a big lead versus the others. But, Azure's sort of the one in the middle, very close to AWS in terms of revenue, maybe somewhat slightly less, but second place. But they've made an investment that's very much in line with where their market share is. So it was an interesting sort of single data point that made you think, okay, is this part of their diversification strategy? Are they the ones who view the need for diversification the most because they also saw success with their ARM chips versus GPU? Is this an indication that they're behind in AI versus the other two? There's some possibilities that's the case as we've seen. Quite a bit of data that's telling us that while AWS still leads in cloud, they tend to feel like they're sort of lagging behind in AI adoption from customers. But it's interesting. It's just a data point, but I think the other piece that it sort of highlights is there's about 30% of market share mapped to NVIDIA GPUs. So if you took all the market share of the 3 or 4 or 5 biggest cloud providers and mapped it to NVIDIA GPU purchase, there's about 30% there that's not accounted for by the big three. And what that's starting to do is open up some market for the CoreWeaves of the world, the Oracles of the world, the Grok X's of the world, sort of the alternative GPU providers to come in and begin to disrupt what that looks like. And so I think that's a very interesting sort of space there. Obviously, we've seen massive buildup of data centers, or at least we've seen massive buildup of or pledging of capital for the next couple of years towards data center build out. Right. So, it's an interesting sort of data point to watch. It's an interesting potential inflection point as we start to see the focus for cloud providers and for companies, kind of around the world from, cloud build out, cloud migrations, cloud expansions to, what can we do with AI where do we have to be with AI? Where do we have to do to accelerate with AI? The AI discussion's obviously taken over quite a bit, and just sort of asking yourself, will AI be the thing that kind of disrupts the old status cloud, the old status quo for cloud? And again, it's still to be determined. And we're only a couple of years into this thing, but it was an interesting data point that's been out there. Next thing on my list was if, as we look at numbers and revenues, AWS still leading. They're around, like I said, 115 to 120 billion dollar run rate. Azure, depending on how you count it, when Azure, we've said this a million times, Azure sort of includes things in, but as of the latest numbers, roughly $100-ish billion run rate. So still second place, but not too far behind. GCP around $50 billion run rate, give or take a little bit. Oracle Cloud has been interesting. Oracle Cloud we've seen growing. They have been much more aggressive in certain things. I think they've been going after certain use cases in which they can try and bring some advantage or differentiation where they didn't necessarily before. So their IaaS cloud business is about $12 billion. Their SaaS cloud business is $16-17 billion. So let's call it 17 billion plus 12 billion, that's 39 billion. Still would be a fourth place in terms of overall number, but that IaaS number has been growing. I think they've been trying to go after places where bandwidth is a huge piece of the calculation. They are trying to make big investments around GPUs. We saw them recently win the Stargate deal with OpenAI. So, I think they're beginning to sort of, their SaaS business is very much focused on, SaaS versions of, some of their suites that used to be on-prem. But I think from an IaaS perspective, they've very much taken the perspective of let's not try and chase every single, Cloud 1.0 feature. Let's sort of try and be a bigger player in Cloud 2.0, try and get ahead of where we were before, try not to be such a laggard as where they are. And, we're beginning to see some inklings of that strategy beginning to pay off. It'll be interesting to see if, they can expand that. But, they seem to be one of the companies along with Google who are, using AI to be a differentiator, and their network and their build out of data centers to be a differentiator versus, essentially AWS, over the last year or so. So that's an interesting thing to sort of keep an eye on. I guess just to put some numbers in perspective, CoreWeave, who we've mentioned a couple of times, sort of a pure GPU play, AI centric play right now. Really only been kind of in that space. I mean, they've been in the GPU space, the data center space since 2017, 2018. They were doing a lot of stuff with crypto, really shifted to AI centric things. Obviously has seen a lot of investment from NVIDIA. But if we look at their numbers, assuming they sort of started this space around 2022, again, with like ChatGPT and so forth, they're right now around $1 billion run rate. And, if we kind of put that in perspective, and again, this is another one of those where we're just sort of pulling data points. I don't know if they're totally relevant, apples to apples, but, it took AWS, they started 2006, 2007. I think it was around 2013-ish before they got to $1 billion. I may have those numbers off. It might be 2012 or whatever. So, they went a good 5, 6, maybe 7 years before they got to $1 billion. CoreWeave has now sort of almost reached $1 billion, I think, per their latest run rate in about 2.5 years. So, that gives you a little sense of, just the investment level around AI, but potentially, the level of spend and the acceleration of spend in this space. And again, we don't know that their run rate will continue for a long time. We'll have to look at profitability and all those other things as the numbers become more transparent. But, they're an example of where this AI spend is beginning to sort of shift from the mainstream, big, 3 or 4 hyperscalers. And then just to put it again, another data point in perspective, OpenAI, who for the most part has built most of their revenue on top of Azure, is expected to do somewhere between $12 and $13 billion this year. So, about a 15% uplift from, just Azure's pure numbers. But it, gives you, again, a sense of like, where is, big chunks of spending going for AI that's in these data centers or sort of additive to these data centers. So just a few numbers. The last thing I had on my list was, just the massive data center build outs that we're seeing. And again, this is going to be very, very interesting. And again, it will be interesting to see how it contrasts or plays together with the sovereignty piece that we talked about at the beginning, right? We've seen, Stargate, which is the sort of OpenAI plus, um, the VC funded types of things, projected around $500 billion. Now, whether or not they'll actually get to that much investment to be determined, but, kind of big numbers announced. Meta announced $60 to $65 billion. Grok announced about $10 billion. AWS announced about $100 billion. Again, these are in new data centers, but again, the thought process is mostly focused on build out for a lot of it for AI. Azure talked about $80 billion. And we've seen out of the last round of talks, again, somewhat politically motivated, but Saudi Arabia and the sovereign wealth funds over there, whether it's Saudi Arabia or kind of across the Middle East, Qatar and some others, projecting around $100 billion in investments in their region alone. So, you've got nearly, if you add all those things up, and again, whether or not the numbers will actually come in there somewhere between, say $500 billion to nearly $1 trillion worth of data center investment. So it'll be very, very interesting to see how power is allocated, how new power sources can be created, whether that's driven by just massive deregulation that allows new power to be built, whether it's done with nuclear. We've seen Microsoft in particular, Meta in particular, sort of looking to build out their own buyout or build out their own nuclear power plants. And so a lot of that will be very, very interesting to watch. It'll be interesting to see, how much the U.S. administration will get involved with trying to deregulate that. The U.S. has been sort of known to be, somewhat overregulated in the energy sector, haven't been able to necessarily create new sources of that as fast as maybe they would need to. But yeah, I think that's going to be a huge space and really looking at, will the same companies who took advantage of huge data center build out over the last 10 plus years, 15 or so years, be able to do that? Who will become the new, important players in this data center build out space? Will we begin to, will we see, a lot of horizontal building or, renting? Will we see white labeling of data centers? Will we see these huge providers, buying up data center providers or even energy companies to try and do things from a vertical perspective? I think all those are in play. I think, this feels like, as we shift from sort of cloud-centric data centers to AI-centric data centers, the maybe some of the rules or the playbook that were used before may not necessarily be the most optimal thing for this. I think, and a lot of it's being written as we go along. So all those things I think will be interesting to watch. Like I said, data sovereignty. Do we see some regional growth? And the last thing I had was, that it does feel a little bit, and again, these things, feel like they kind of come and go and you can't necessarily read into them, but it does feel like, we've seen some rationalization from the massive hiring that was happening during COVID when the cloud providers and a lot of the largest internet companies were hiring people at ginormous things. I think we saw some rationalization of that happen in, 2022, 2023 as the pandemic went away. Looks like we're starting to see again some rationalization of headcount. And I don't mean to highlight that in a negative sense, but I do think it'll be interesting to watch. As we see Azure and AWS in particular as the two leaders, whether or not these employee layoffs, these sort of very public articles and internal memos are getting leaked from CEO letters talking about more harsh review cycles, more frequent review cycles, and how much you can keep people motivated when the stock price isn't necessarily growing the way it did before. The review cycles are tougher. People don't feel like they can maybe necessarily get promoted as much. But also just do you start to have situations like we're probably going to have at Meta as they're trying to build out these super intelligence groups, even within an Azure or an AWS, what's going on culture wise between the people working on AI projects and the people working on non-AI projects? Is there a huge divide between them? Are you seeing people jump ship? Are you seeing people trying to move into those groups, or is there still good career paths and innovation and new things coming out of the cloud cycle of things? So I think all those are going to be really interesting to watch, not only for the rest of this year but into next year. We're talking about a lot of money. Very, very big companies trying to make big moves. And again, the pieces on the board are they're very, very sort of fungible in terms of what's going on. So, I don't think we're going to see, AWS move to number 4 anytime soon. They've got a very large moat, very large installed base. Customers, for the most part, are very happy working with them. They're very happy working with Azure. But, again, I think we're beginning to see some shift in a market that I think we, kind of thought if you went back 2-3 years ago, 4 years ago, was probably pretty well cemented and was going to be what it was going to be. And AI is essentially generative AI is disrupting that in very, very big ways. So, anyways, I'm going to wrap it up there. I think it's an interesting place for us to be mid-year, and I think we'll continue to follow this throughout the year, and we'll check back in at end of year and sort of see if any of our predictions or observations held true. So, with that, thank you all for listening. Apologize for this one going out a little bit late. Hopefully, you'll still get this one on Sunday, and if not, you'll get it Monday morning. And if so, I hope your week's going well. And with that, thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.